Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to our very last discussion of the book Humankind. We're going to be doing the epilogue at the end, but before that, I'm going to cover a few more basic terms that I want you to know before you graduate from this class. So, last time we talked about democracy, and this time we're going to talk about capitalism and socialism. So, capitalism oftentimes in this country gets used interchangeably with democracy, as if all countries that are democratic are also capitalist and vice versa. But in fact, that's not true. Capitalism and democracy are separable. They are two distinct systems. Democracy is a political system, capitalism is an economic system, and they float about without each other. So don't confuse the two of them and don't use them as if they mean the same thing or as if they always apply to the same examples. So the definition that we're going to use for capitalism in this class is the private ownership of the means of production combined with a system of wage labor. So when you take the ability to subsist, to live, and you put that into the hands of some, you put ownership and control over that into the hands of some, that is a few private individuals, rather than everyone, which would be in the commons or in the form of the state, then you have capitalism, but only if it's also combined with a system of wage labor, because there's other systems of private ownership of the means of production that aren't fully capitalist because they don't yet have wage labor as a facet. So when you get those two things combined, we have capitalism. Capitalism is not an either or scenario, it's rather a continuum. So you either have more private ownership of the means of production and more wage labor, or you have less, but you can still have an economy be essentially capitalist with some other sort of barriers around that system. So it's not a straightforward 0-1 up, down, yes, no kind of question. It's more how much private ownership versus how little private ownership does any particular economic system have. So just to put a little bit more specificity to that point, there are different kinds of capitalism, many in fact. I'm going to give you just a few terms here. One that you'll hear very often is a totally free market, which is often called laissez-faire capitalism or unfettered capitalism. This exists only in theory, in the abstract. There never has been a system in which capitalism existed without the constraints of the state. Always in the history of capitalism, there has been some state control, some state limitations, but also some propping up by states of private interests. So till date, we have not yet seen a capitalism that exists without any controls on it by a state system. Then we have authoritarian capitalism, which I think China exemplifies really well right now. We usually think of China as being a communist country, and it's true that right now communism is the Communist Party rules China. But the present economic system is a form of capitalism inside the larger apparatus of state control. So the Communist Party does control ultimately what happens even with capitalist companies, but it still is a capitalist free-for-all within those boundaries. And that has been happening really since the 1990s, but prior to that, it was not a capitalist system at all. So maybe you weren't aware that there's a lot of capitalism in China, but indeed there is, only that it is within this state control that makes it authoritarian capitalism, because the government exerts ultimate control over even private companies. Then there is a form of state capitalism in which the state itself, that is the government itself, invests in a capitalist market and makes money and runs businesses, runs things like real estate, owns a whole bunch of industry. So the state is not socialist in the sense that the state is determining how it happens, but instead the state is putting itself out there like a venture capitalist on behalf of the larger population. Singapore is one good example of that. Then there's the forms of capitalism that are more familiar around the world. Keynesian capitalism, also called social democracy, which was instated in the United States and the United Kingdom back in the 1930s and 40s, has been eroded somewhat more recently for what's now called neoliberal capitalism. But most of the wealthiest countries today continue to have some form of Keynesian capitalism, so social democracy that puts checks on private ownership of the means of production and checks and controls on wage labor and redistribute some of that wealth. We'll talk about it again in a minute. But note that that is basically the system that has been operating in the United States for some time, only that that's beginning to change and erode to become more neoliberal today. So neoliberal capitalism is where you roll back the regulations of the state, you roll back the expenditure of the state, you shrink the size of the state, and you give over more control and more leeway to the private sector. That is both in the form of the business sector and in the form of nonprofits, non-governmental organizations to run society at large, both the economy and how we address social issues like poverty or like education. So the private sector takes a much bigger role in neoliberal capitalism. This has really only been implemented to an extreme in countries like Bolivia and Honduras largely by the International Monetary Fund's policies that have forced those countries in that direction. We're going to be talking about that later in the semester. But even though neoliberal capitalism has been created as a theory and espoused in the United States and in the United Kingdom, it's really only been fully implemented in countries other than the United States and the United Kingdom. So laissez-faire capitalism, authoritarian capitalism, state capitalism, Keynesian capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, all different forms of a basic system in which private ownership of the means of production and wage labor are allowed to flourish with varying levels of state control, state intervention, and state redistribution of wealth. So, social democracy or Keynesian capitalism or democratic socialism, there's slight differences between all of these things, but to reiterate what I said a minute ago, it's capitalist oriented at its core. It has overall a mixed economy where there is a capitalist engine that drives things, but that is met with a redistribution of resources through the form of education and healthcare and lots of poverty reduction measures that then allow for greater levels of democracy and that insist upon greater levels of economic regulation to stabilize the economy. And this enables a strong social safety net for widespread social well-being. And I'll show you some slides in a minute that illustrate examples of how this plays out. So here's some countries with really strong social safety nets. That's again, government expenditure, high expenditure on things like education, health care, taking care of the elderly in the form of Social Security, taking care of children in the form of child care, all of the ways in which the population as a whole needs to be cared for. Those are all facets of what we call a social safety net, addressing poverty in particular. So here you can see countries and the percentage of their GDP, their gross domestic product, that is the total value that they amass in a year as a country, what percentage of that they spend on a social safety net. So France is the highest at 31%, But you'll note that the United States is high up there on that list. It's a little less than 20%, but still much higher than many countries, even surprisingly higher than Canada and the Netherlands in 2019, although where that is, since that point, we don't have data for it right here. So again, this is the legacy of Keynesian economics that was implemented here in the United States in the 30s and 40s, and that persists with us today in the form of investment in public education and public health, and taking care of the retired and the elderly, and poverty reduction measures. All of these are part of the social safety net that all of these countries invest in heavily. So how is that different than socialism? We have social democracy or democratic socialism. How is that different than just straight up socialism? Socialism you can think of as quite distinct from capitalism, in that in capitalism, private ownership of the means of production and wage labor system keeps a high level of inequality, whereas in socialism, there is the state control of the means of production, and there's not wage labor, but there is labor that goes into the state control of the economy. So we're going to define socialism for our purposes in this class as the state ownership and control of the means of production, as opposed to the private ownership of the means of production. And again, no wage labor, but a provision of one's needs by the state. Sometimes you'll hear this term used to mean something more like a social democracy or democratic socialism, cooperative policies that seek equitable benefits for all citizens, but I'm using it differently here. I'm using it to mean state control of the economy, state planning in the economy. So what are some drawbacks of that form of government, of a state that controls and plans the economy from the top down? We've seen that definitely in Maoist China. We saw it also under Stalinist Russia. In both of those, Stalinist USSR, in both of those countries, we also witnessed widespread famine and massive problems that were a direct result of direct, centrally planned economic policies. So what's wrong with that really is that if you have a centrally controlled economy, you get really inefficient detection of demand. That is what people want or need. That information of want and need doesn't flow readily into the center that is determining what the economy is going to produce. And as a result, you get a lot of shortages and surpluses. You get too much of some things and too little of others, because those who are planning in the center don't really know what people need or want as well. And you don't get the boom and bust cycle quite that you get in a market economy in capitalism, but you do get still levels of high output fluctuation as the center attempts to understand what it is that people need, and produces again these consequent shortages and surpluses back and forth. So this is an inefficient means of detecting needs, in large part because when you have hyper centralized power, as you did under Stalin and Mao, you tend not to get people telling them what's wrong with the economy, because people don't want to get fired or killed or exiled. And so those who are in the center making decisions oftentimes don't get the information that they need when that power rests upon the ability and the desire to get rid of people who naysay or speak ill of the system. So power and a poorly planned economy go hand in hand. So I told you a minute ago when we were going to talk about social democracies that I'd give you some examples of how social democracies tend to play out. So Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, all of these countries up in the Nordic-speaking regions, they are all of them social democracies that have a higher level of social safety net than the United States. And interestingly, we tend to think of a capitalist system as being really good at locating merit and rewarding merit, hard work, and innovation, and therefore enabling a greater level of social mobility. So that the idea within capitalism, we think, is that, in fact, people will rise or fall based on their usefulness to the system, and therefore they're going to have greater social mobility in that system. But in fact, that's not what we see playing out within a more purely capitalist system, because within a purely capitalist system, you tend to get the accumulation of money and power in certain hands that then pass that money and power on through the generations in ways that disallows merit from really gaining its full reward. So interestingly, it's in fact the social democracies that allow innovation and allow capitalism, but that have a check in place in which they redistribute wealth and opportunity to everyone. You see those social democracies actually having a higher level of social mobility than we would tend to think. So the United States, which is a little less social democratic than countries like Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden and Iceland, actually has lower rates of social mobility. These countries that level the playing field for everyone in their countries actually see higher rates of merit-based fluctuation within their class system than the United States, which is much lower than the social democracies that are more robust than ours. So here's a map of inequality that relates to that ranking of social mobility on the last slide. You'll see it's really quite fascinating where inequality is best and where it's worst. You'll note that the darker blue has less inequality, and that you tend to get less inequality in the social democracies: Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, many of the countries in Northern Europe. And you tend to get that worsens in countries like the United States, and then it gets really quite bad in places that have a very strong history of colonialism, and slavery, like Brazil and more recently South Africa. So you can see where inequality has yet to be mitigated. And you might think that inequality is not such an issue, but in fact, as it relates to social mobility and therefore the ability for people to innovate and to gain reward for their merit, in fact, it does have an important role to play. Another thing that is potentially surprising is that the United States is quite low on the Global Peace Index. We are 132 out of 163 countries. The Global Peace Index is put together by a think tank in Australia, and they rank countries based on not only internal peace, how much crime, how safe people are, but also how many refugees leave the area, how many people are internally displaced within the country, how much war the country is involved in outside, how many people from that country are dying in wars, either internal wars or external wars. All of this is factored together to create the Global Peace Index. And you'll notice that Iceland, Ireland, Austria, New Zealand, Singapore, Switzerland are all quite high up. And these are, again, many of the countries that you saw as having low inequality and being high on the social democracy index. Not all, but most. Corruption is another thing that may surprise you. So that countries that have a really strong social safety net also have very low levels of corruption. If you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because if there's a lot of redistribution of opportunity and redistribution of wealth, then there's going to be greater equality and less need for corruption because there's less ability for corruption because there's less space between people in the first place. But you'll see that United States is not very high on this corruption perception index, and countries in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in parts of South and Southeast Asia are fairly high. So another one that's quite interesting is ease of doing business. What businesses report about their experiences in setting themselves up and in getting going and in being able to hire people and fire people and do business. A variety of facets to what it is to start and maintain a business. And the countries that rank really highly in this are many of them, again, those social democracies, not all. The United States does rank quite highly in the ease of doing business. So too does the United Kingdom and also the country Georgia, interestingly. But Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and New Zealand, which is another strong social safety net country, these are all ranked quite highly in ease of doing business. So oftentimes countries with strong social safety nets are talked about in terms of red tape and the impossibility of doing business and living there. And in fact, that's not true based on reports from business people attempting to set up and run businesses in these countries. So you may have heard this term American exceptionalism. I just want to define it for you as one more term this semester. American exceptionalism is the belief that the United States is unique, distinctive, exemplary, special when compared to other nations. And there are definitely some interesting facets of our history that set us apart. We do have the oldest continuous use of a constitution, so we have kind of the oldest democracy that exists still till today. That's true, but as you can see from the last few slides, we don't have the highest social mobility. We tend to tell ourselves that in terms of the American dream, right? The ability to get ahead by working hard. We don't have the highest level of social mobility. We're not very high we're very low on the peace index. We're not very high in the corruption index. We're not the top of the ease of doing business, even though we are up there with ease of doing business. We're not the most educated. There are a bunch of ways in which we are not exceptional, but there are a few ways in which we are exceptional. The primary way in which we are truly exceptional is our concentration of wealth, not our distribution of wealth, right? We already looked at inequality. We're not great in terms of inequality, but we do have, in terms of sheer accumulation of wealth, in a few hands, we are exceptional. We are the wealthiest country on earth, and in that sense, we are truly set apart. So you can look at this map and see other places where there's a high concentration of wealth, and you might be surprised to know that that's India and China. Interestingly, India is famed for being very poor, but in fact, it has a huge amount of wealth. It's just that wealth is not well distributed, and it has gained that wealth largely in recent years through a lot of liberalization of the economy, opening up the economy. So it is now more of a neoliberal economy than a state-run form of socialism, which is what it used to be. So it has allowed itself to accumulate a lot of wealth, but that is not well distributed, so you have a lot of very poor people as well. But China, India, Japan are on par now in terms of the total wealth they have with countries like France and the United Kingdom and Germany. But the United States still is, bar none, the wealthiest country in the world. We also have seen our inequality rise and fall over the years. So our inequality got really quite high prior to the stock market crash of 1928 and the Great Depression. But due to the Keynesian economic policies that got put in place in the 1930s and 40s, we saw very low levels of inequality for several decades. But as we have rolled those regulations and those investments, government investments, back starting in the 1980s, in an era that is called neoliberal capitalism, we have seen inequality rise again. And this is a very famous graph from an economist named Thomas Piketty. But this graph, I'm showing it to you because it's a famous graph, but it has continued to go up since then, so that now we have really inordinate amounts of inequality in our country, both incredible amounts of wealth and incredible amounts of inequality, largely, as we talked about in recent discussions, as a result of the rise of the internet companies that now dominate so much of the world. Another way in which the United States is truly exceptional is in our military expenditure. So we are well beyond what any other country spends on its military, including China, our closest rival, which spends not quite a third of what we spend, but getting there, and yet has a much larger population than the United States. So we are exceptional in our wealth, we're exceptional in our military expenditure, and we're getting more and more exceptional in our inequality. We're not beyond other countries yet in our inequality, but we are getting there. So what did you notice in these various details about all of these countries? I think what's fairly evident is that for social goods that you would think of, like inequality, like social mobility, also health measures, which I didn't show you, happiness measures, which I also didn't show you. There is quite a bit to be said for social democracies, which marry both a capitalist economic engine and a government system of regulation, redistribution, and care for the population that keeps a check on the ways in which capitalism can get out of hand and can grow to be highly unequal and therefore highly unfair. So a system that both has a capitalist engine and has an overlay of checks and balances, regulations on top of that, and redistributions, seems to have, as far as we can tell from a variety of measures, the best benefit for the greatest number of people of the systems that we currently have on offer today. That is, like, straight up state socialism or state capitalism, authoritarian capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, and Keynesian capitalism. It seems to be the social democracies that have had the best outcomes so far. Okay, now shifting over to the epilogue of the book, I'm just going to run through the 10 rules that he provides, and we're going to talk about what to make of them, given what we've discussed in terms of the era of polarization that we're currently living in. So, Bregman suggests that when we are in doubt, we should assume the best about other people. What I like about this is that it takes into account the fact that there are very few sociopaths out there in the world. Yes, everyone has their own motivations, everyone is out for themselves in some ways, but by and large, people are essentially decent and want your best in the same way that they want their own good, and that there is therefore every reason to hope that you can work with them. So rather than to doubt them and to work against them, we can instead assume the best of them. I think this is really an orientation to the question of other humans that both gives us the best mental health and gives us the best outcomes when you take into account the placebo effect of the Pygmalion effect, right? That by assuming the best of people and actually expecting good out of them, you treat them in such a way that they in fact give you good back, that their outcomes when you treat them well are better than when you treat them poorly. His rule number 2 is to think in win-win scenarios. So rather than think about how to beat the people around you, instead think about how you and they can merge your interests and operate together so that you both are winning. And that kind of an attitude, I think, then has ultimately the best outcome for everyone as a whole. It is the system of the commons. It is the system of social democracy that sees ultimately good being distributed to everyone rather than being in the hands and the control of just the few. Ask more questions. He says that we should not assume the golden rule. This is actually, I think, a great point, right? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you assumes that you know how others want to be treated. And instead, he suggests you should go out and find out how people want to be treated, that you should not presume you know very much about the people around you, but instead attempt to make space for new ideas and for new perspectives and for new ways of being that you might not have considered yet. So ask more questions. He contrasts empathy and compassion in the book. Empathy being the feeling that you get when you share the pain of someone else, and compassion being the feeling that you get when you want to relieve the pain that someone else is feeling. So rather than dwelling in the pain, instead focus on your desire to relieve that pain. Focus on your desire to do something about it. And this will then not leave you paralyzed in the pain of the world, but instead it will help you focus on action. 5, try to understand others even when you don't get where they're coming from. In an era of hyperpolarization in which it's very easy for us to demonize the people around us and to treat them like they are really awful, as opposed to trying to understand how it is that they think the way they think, how it is that they feel the way they feel, and what motivates them ideologically, what ideas are guiding them. Instead of trying to just cancel them, so to speak, trying to understand them will get you a lot further. And this will help us ultimately to do away with, dissipate the polarization that has made our day-to-day lives and our systems and our country untenable at this point. 6, love your own as others love their own. So Bregman points out that we are in our basic human nature a little tribalistic. We tend to care more about people who are part of our social lives or part of our social spheres or who are like us in some way, people that we perceive to be like us in some way, than others who are outside. And he says not to necessarily feel bad about that, but instead to try and understand that what is true for us is true for everyone around the world, so that we love those that we care about that seem similar to us in some way, but that we ultimately are not that different than people all around the world, and that they feel like that for their people the way that we feel for our people. I have some qualms with this idea, but I think what it does do, what it sort of offers us, is the possibility to be self-reflexive about our tribalism, to notice the ways in which we tend to have emotions and allegiances for certain people and not for others, and to start to question that and think about how that is built within us. And by noticing it, then we can help to mitigate it or help to make it less prominent in the way in which we actually act in our lives. Avoid the news. Now, this one is tough, right? Because as good critical thinkers, you need to be aware of what's going on in the world. So how do you do that without getting caught up in the news? Because the cycle of the news is not a healthy one, either for your mental health or really for your knowledge. It can suck you in the attention economy. It's all about pulling you in and keeping you there, right? So how can you know what you need to know while not getting stuck in the daily news and like headline news? And as we've talked about in other discussions, you can look for ways to catch yourself up on things and get a more in-depth analysis other than focusing on headline news. So not the latest that's come out, but rather something that is more digested, more complete, You can do that in the form of podcasts. You can do that in the form of long form analyses in magazines or in books even. But constantly monitoring the latest headlines is not a good use of your attention or your mental health. Don't punch Nazis. So this is related very much to the earlier discussion on polarization, the earlier comments on polarization. You don't achieve anything by getting into fistfights with people that you don't agree with. It doesn't actually move the needle in the ways that you want it to. What actually does move the needle in ways that you want it to is by going the opposite direction. So in the examples given in the book, the groups that reached out to and showed care and love for actual Nazis had much more success than the towns that got up and were aggressive and attempted to stamp out Nazis, right? So love and compassion are the ways in which we win people back out of darkness, as opposed to fighting them because of the ways in which they're lost in the darkness. 9, come out of the closet. Don't be ashamed to do good. So this is based on the idea that we are social creatures by nature, and we are copycats. We learn from each other based on what other people are doing. So that this is what Instagram's all about, right? Posting what you're doing, or influencers who then have copycats who are trying to be like them. So what he's saying is be loud about doing good. Spread the word about doing good so that you can try and get other people to copycat what you're doing. And that by being loud about being and doing good in the world, you are actually helping to offset this feeling or this widespread belief that there's nothing that can be done, that we're stuck with what we've got, that things are just going to keep getting worse. So work against that and be thoughtful about spreading your goodness and what you are doing to be good in the world. And finally, as a conclusion for the book as a whole, to be realistic, the idea is that if we truly understand what human nature really is, then our realism will reflect that. So realism will reflect the fact that humans are highly social. Humans want to do good for each other. They want to cooperate with each other. And that we care about our groups so much so that we would actually sacrifice ourselves for them. All of this will help us recreate new institutions that take humans as they actually are on the inside, rather than working against them with institutions that train them or force them to be something that they're not. So if we understand human nature fully and completely, our realism will help us completely revamp, reshape the institutions that society rests on today. It's a pretty exciting idea. So that's the last discussion for Humankind, and we're going to move on to exam 2 at this point. I will be putting up the study guide for that next week, so watch out for that. And be sure to go back and check your notes on everything, check your old quizzes, and reach out to me with questions on things that you don't understand or things that you want more discussion of. I am definitely here to meet with you, talk with you, or respond to email at any time. So until I hear from you, and for the rest of the week, have a good one. Bye.